Welcome to the inaugural episode of a new series of videos where I will be discussing the solo adventures of my favorite superhero. That's right, the Star-Spangled Avenger, the shield-slinging, wing-headed Sentinel of Liberty, Captain Goddamn America. From the Golden Age all the way through modern times, I'll be making my way through the Masterworks collection and any other assorted volumes of the character I can get my hands on. And if I time this right, it should be 4th of July, which is a really great time to, it's just fitting. I do have an outline. I have something scripted in this video, but this is a podcast series. It's not going to be heavily edited, so I can actually get these out at a, consistent or semi-consistent rate. I am kind of jumping the gun on this one a little bit in order to try to make that 4th of July deadline. I do have a couple other projects I'm working on, and I'm going to try knocking those out first before I start doing the series in earnest. But I've been chomping at the bit to talk more about this character and his history, and I really just want to use this whole series as an excuse to talk about comic books and talk about their history and all the things that I find interesting about them. And Captain America is a perfect character to do that with because he's not the first superhero. He's not even technically the first Marvel superhero. That honor goes to the original Human Torch, who debuted, I think, one whole year earlier. But he has been consistent. And he has been consistent in a way that even older, more venerated heroes like Superman and Batman kind of haven't. And I'm also someone who's really into history and politics, and Captain America offers a lot on that front as well. Each of these videos will kind of touch on some of the historical basis for these adventures and how their writer's history and background and what was going on at the time helped shape this character and how he's changed as the writers and as the times have changed. There's a lot there that I just find interesting. So even when Captain America is bad, or when his comics are bad at least, there's still interesting things to kind of pick apart in there as well. This isn't going to be like a detailed overview of the chapters. I highly recommend reading at least some of the Masterworks. I'll recommend the ones that I want to recommend, and I'll be like, this one, skip it, whatever. First one, definitely get Captain America Golden Age Masterworks Volume 1. I think every comic book fan should have at least some version of Captain America #1 within their collection, assuming that they even want a collection or have any interest in the character whatsoever, at least. But there's also an introduction by Roy Thomas, a fellow Missourian, by the way, and he really outlines what I find so fascinating about these first couple issues of Captain America, and he does it in a lot more, succinct fashion than I'm going to in this video. Everyone has seen the cover of Captain America #1, released in April of 1941. It's called Meet Captain America. It's written by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby with art by Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby draws this entire book, and Jack Kirby is a legend and a visionary within the comic book medium. He's one of the most influential comic book artists of all time. Possibly in the #1 spot. Will Eisner would be the only other one that might have a more solid reputation. But Jack Kirby's art style never really gelled with me as much as, say, Steve Ditko or John Romita Sr. Rest in peace to all those guys, by the way. John Romita just passed earlier this year, Steve Ditko a few years ago, and Jack Kirby, I think, passed away back in the 90s. Jack Kirby has a very kind of funky art style. I love his creature designs. There's quite a few creature features in these early Captain America comics and they're my favorite parts of this. And the original design for the Red Skull is also one of my favorite designs for the Red Skull period. Like, it's just Jack Kirby's weird, idiosyncratic, I think is a word I could use here, art style. It doesn't work for me a lot of times. It didn't really work for me for like the early X-Men comics or Fantastic Four, except for The Thing. There's a reason why The Thing is the best character of the Fantastic Four, design-wise. Jack Kirby got better with age. So the legendary comic book artist that we all know and admire, he's not really here in the 1940s. He's not there yet. These are some ugly looking designs, especially poor Bucky Barnes. Bucky Barnes looks like an old man trying to cosplay as Robin. It's actually surprising how much of the Captain America iconography is in this very first issue and how much of it isn't. Captain America has a pentagonal shield at first, but there was another comic book character called the Shield who also had like a pentagonal shield design, and they kind of feud with Timely Comics over that design, and that's actually why Jack Kirby redesigned Captain America going into the second issue, which is where he had the more like complete cowl mask and the circular shield that has become iconic. But what I find most fascinating about this, it's March 1941 when this comic book is released. And it features Captain America socking Hitler on the jaw, which is a dope image. It's one of the most iconic comic book covers of that era, at least. Possibly all time, arguably all time. And we weren't at war yet. A lot of people kind of conflate America's presence in World War II. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds about Hitler's rise to power. Hitler rose to power like 1932, 1933. Then you have the Night of the Long Knives. Then the various invasions. And the World War II didn't really get started until like 1938, 1939. It officially began when Hitler invaded France, is when World War II began. Because Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, practiced appeasement, so every time Hitler would invade another country, Chamberlain would be like, "Oh, no, that's fine. He deserves that land. And Germany needs more land and more resources. We'll just let him take it." And then he pulled that stuff with France, and that was crossing the line. Another thing that's kind of hard to remember is that the world at large did not know about the Holocaust until it was too late. Most Germans didn't even know what Hitler was doing with the Jews. They just thought he was racist. Like every other world leader at the time. Like, as far as most Americans in early 1941 were concerned, Hitler wasn't treating the Jews any differently than we were treating African Americans at the time. It's just a sad fact of the time. Even people who weren't racist were still, like, apathetic. They didn't care. Like, a lot of people even people who weren't racist, didn't really care that people were racist. And that's where a lot of the problems actually stem from. Like, I think this quote might have actually been originally about Hitler, was, like, evil triumphs when good men do nothing. And, lucky for us, we had a few good men who were willing to do something before we got involved with the war. In fact, and this is something that we will continue to discuss as we get deeper and deeper into Captain America's history. Captain America was originally created as a piece of propaganda. It was a piece of propaganda to try to convince the rest of America that going to war against Nazi Germany was a good thing and that we should help our allies in Europe. America kind of had its own problems we were dealing with, the Great Depression and all that stuff. Our own fits with, the civil rights movement was still kind of in its infancy, but it was very much a thing at the time. Uh, Failure of the education system is how we teach the civil rights movement. Civil rights did not start in 1960 and end in 1968. It went well before 1960, and it continues all the way to the present day, depending on, where you draw the line on that stuff. But yeah, in 1941, most Americans were hesitant to go to war. FDR, our president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was himself hesitant and himself kind of on the fence, really. On one hand, FDR liked several Marxist talking points. Conservatives will tell you this all the time, that the New Deal was basically socialist gobbledygook. Important thing to understand is that socialism is an economic policy. It's not a political or a government policy. Like, you can have any kind of form of government and still have socialism. Fascism was derived from socialism. Nazism was derived from fascism, which itself was derived from socialism. Communism, obviously, derived from socialism. Democratic socialism, which is what we see in a lot of countries today. America, today, has a lot of socialist tendencies, or has a lot of socialist policies that we enforce that come from FDR. And I believe he was even at one point quoted praising Benito Mussolini, the de facto kind of inventor of fascism, or the coiner of fascism, rather. Mussolini himself grew up within the Italian Socialist Party and kind of got sick of the way that party was being ran, and so he kind of took it over and turned it into the fascism party. And then Hitler plagiarized a lot of his talking point and made it just a smidge more racist. That's what Nazism is. Nazism is socialism if it was really, really racist. Socialism, even fascism, isn't inherently racism. At least not as much as, Aryan supremacy, genocidal Nazi regime. Couple of little fun facts there. But even though FDR didn't really have a personal grudge against Hitler and Mussolini, he did want to help Britain and France, and he just didn't have congressional approval. And the way you get congressional approval is to convince your congressman and convince the majority of the congressmen in the country that something is a good idea. Now, how do you do that? You have the people call their congressman. How do you convince the people to call their congressman? That's where the propaganda comes in, folks. So, the idea here was, this was Timely Magazine. This was, they went through a couple name changes. I think they went through like one or two other name changes before they settled on Marvel Comics. But Timely Magazine, as they were called at the time, they were known for like that horror, and they did some war stories as well throughout the 40s. In the 50s, they would be mostly known for horror and romance. And then the Silver Age happened. We'll get all to that when we get to the Commie Smasher Captain America era, because that's all very important to how that very short-lived run ended up becoming short-lived. One suspicious thing about a lot of the anti-Hitler propaganda for a good cause is still propaganda, by the way. Like, let's not mince words. There is a such thing as positive propaganda or propaganda for a good cause. It just has to be any propaganda for a cause you believe in, you will consider good propaganda. So, Hitler and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the USSR, Soviet Union, were actually originally allied. And then Hitler invaded Russia because he needed the resources, because he was running his own economy into the ground, and Nazism is just such a terrible political structure. All socialism in general, I'm going to be very biased here politically in these videos. Socialism in all of its permutations is just awful, and it always leads to stuff like Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, or modern day Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Like, it just, you bleed all your resources because you're not managing them right, because you're trying to just give it all. You're seizing the means of production. You don't know how to manage them. You give it all away. People don't who are supposed to give it away end up keeping it because greed is just a part of human nature. You end up wrecking everything, and then you have to invade your neighbors or kill your civilians. Like, those are your only two options in late game socialism. Hitler chose to invade his neighbors and also kill his citizens because he was racist. And Stalin just sent people to the gulags whenever he was running out of bread for the bread lines. But it wasn't until Hitler started invading the Soviet Union that a lot of the people stateside started pumping out that kind of propaganda. And we didn't really draw the connections until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Turns out that ever since the 1920s, the Soviet Union had been effectively funding Hollywood and funding a lot of newspapers here in the States, and that's why. So there's an argument you can make that Captain America effectively exists because Russia wanted America to fight Germany. That's a tough pill to swallow. And I'm not sure if I totally buy that being the case. I do buy, like, Timely Magazine giving it their seal of approval for that reason. But I believe that Captain America's actual creation was a little more genuine because he was created by two Jewish men, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. And I'll get more into their backstory possibly in the next... Yeah, probably in the next one. I don't want these videos to be more than like 30 minutes long, and I've already been going for almost 20 minutes. And I do want something to talk about for next time. I'm not going to have as much prelude to go through. But as I said before, a lot of Captain America's iconography was here in the very first issue. First issue has a version of his origin story. We all know Captain America's origin story, right? He's a soldier, or he's a scrawny kid named Steve Rogers, grew up in Brooklyn, wanted to join the army, couldn't, got recruited for the Super Soldier Project by Dr. Erskine, and got injected with the Super Soldier formula and Vita Rays, and became a Super Soldier ass kicker. So, in this original issue, the Doctor's name is Reinstein, not Erskine, which kind of confused me, but I was like, oh yeah, this is anti-Germany propaganda. For the first couple issues here, there are no German good guys. They do rectify that later. It doesn't take them long to rectify that. Where they'll start having, like, the good Germans. Because there were a lot of good Germans, and there were a lot of Germans who straight up abandoned Germany because of Hitler and helped out the Allied forces. And the retcon of Reinstein being Dr. Erskine, or Reinstein's real name being Erskine, is an acknowledgement of that. And so this original version of Cap's origin story is itself, within the mainline Marvel 616 continuity, is itself propaganda from the 40s. We don't get the real origin story until Tales of Suspense number something, like 20 years later, is when we get the real origin story of Captain America, which is the exact same story. It's just some of the names are different. It's fun to kind of pick apart stuff like that. Another thing about comic books at this time, and I didn't really know this until I read this, and then I started looking at some 1940s Batman comics as well. They would jam like 3 to 5 adventures in a single comic book, and also have backups with other characters, and the ones here, like Tuck the Cave Boy and Hurricane, son of Thor, who is a character I never heard of. And I read quite a lot of Thor comics back in the day. I read most of the Walt Simonson run. I read the Straczynski run. I've of course read a lot of the Jack Kirby, Stan Lee era Thor stuff. Um, Hurricane never came up in any of those, and I looked him up. Apparently, he is one of the Eternals. Like Hurricane was just a name he went by during the 1940s, and he's one of the Eternals named. I don't remember off the top of my head because I have never once given a fuck about the Eternals. I don't even like the New Gods, and the New Gods are just an objectively better version of the Eternals. But yeah, Steve Rogers, Bucky Barnes shows up right at the end of the first adventure, and they go on to have many merry adventures all throughout the 1940s. And we'll get to Bucky Barnes and the various retcons surrounding him and his death / non-death as we get into the 60s, because that's when it kind of becomes important. And then again in the mid-2000s when Ed Brubaker takes over and does the Winter Soldier storyline. Red Skull is in this very first issue. He's not in the first adventure. He's in the third one. The first adventure is just Captain America's origin. The second one is he's fighting a psychic. And in the third one, he fights the Red Skull. And the Red Skull is not Johann Schmidt here. Yeah, he's not Johann Schmidt in this issue. He's called George Maxson. The first time they bring up Johann Schmidt is in Captain America #7, and I think they do retcon it to where George Maxson was just an alias for Johann Schmidt. And he's a Nazi saboteur. And that's the thing, like, Captain America, throughout the 40s, isn't really a soldier. Namely because America wasn't at war yet. So he couldn't be. Like, that'd be like, okay, come on, guys. Like, we're not even at war yet. You can't have him fighting on the front lines with troops. He's a counter spy. He works with British intelligence. That's where, the original Agent X-13, who is called X-13 in this very first issue, and that would be Peggy Carter later on, who is played by Haley Atwell. There'd be some other retcons regarding her because as time went on, because remember Captain America got brought back in the 60s, so it had only been 20 years. So Peggy Carter was like alive, just kind of older, and that was also the deal with like Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos and Johann Schmidt and all them. And then they kept on having to like, she went from Sharon Carter, Captain America's primary love interest throughout the Silver Age and all the way through modern day. She started off as like Peggy Carter's younger sister, and then it was Peggy Carter's like niece, and now it's like her great niece, I guess, probably. But Agent X-13 is not called Peggy Carter at all in the 40s. That is a later retcon that was made in the 60s, and whenever I get to that first couple like Silver Age Captain America stuff, like once I get into his revitalization in the Avengers and his adventures and Tales of Suspense and the launching or relaunching of his own book in the mid-60s, I'm gonna have to just make a list of all the goddamn retcons that made that possible. But she's called Betty Ross, which is also the name of the Hulk's primary love interest 20 years later. And like, I think the what ended up being retconned in is that Betty Ross was her name in the 1940s, but then they reckoned out to where like she was being called Betsy Ross, but Betsy Ross was just a cover name for Peggy Carter, aka the original Agent X-13. Well, a lot of spy stuff and a lot of horror stuff as well, which is what I really like about, or what I've really come to admire about the Joe Simon era of Captain America in particular. It's in one of the introductions to one of these Golden Age Masterworks. I want to say it's the second one, where someone talks about a conversation he had with Joe Simon once upon a time, and how Joe Simon was like, I originally envisioned Captain America as a horror book. Captain America, at his core, is a political horror story. He fights spies and saboteurs, but not just any spies and saboteurs. He fights vampire spies and zombie saboteurs and alien monstrosities and very racist caricatures of the Oriental peoples and Germans and lot of good old Japanese racism in these older comics. It's actually in Captain America #2 where they really double down on the one of the adventures in Captain America #2, released April 1941, is the Ageless Orientals Who Would Not Die. And it was very uncomfortable to read. Captain America had his redesign in the second book, and then in the third book, they brought back the Red Skull, Return of the Red Skull. And the other noteworthy thing about Captain America #3 is that it is also Stan Lee's first ever writing job. It's not in the comics, so these were like variety magazines, by the way. Like they'd have like Captain America #3, which had Stan Lee's first writing credit, had 3 Captain America comic book adventures: The Return of the Red Skull, The Hunchback of Hollywood and the Movie Murder, The Queer Case of the Murdering Butterfly and the Ancient Mummies, which is my favorite of the 3. A novelette, which is like a one-page, it's a short story, basically, being printed in here, called Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge, which is a mouthful of a title. That script was by Stan Lee. Then you had Tuck Cave Boy, Atlantis and the False King, Amazing Spy Adventures, and then Hurricane Master of Speed. No, another one of those. Hurricane. I tried reading like the Tuck stuff. I tried reading all of these. Some were easier to get through than others. I ended up giving up on all the Hurricane stuff. It's the weakest of this whole era of Captain America, and they drop it eventually. I want to say they drop it around like issue 10 or something. Of the various like backup storyline stuff, I actually really ended up liking Headline Hunter, the foreign correspondent. But yeah, one other noteworthy thing I wanted to point out in Captain America #1, Captain America does not actually fight Hitler. I think he does in... I might be thinking of one of the Tales of Suspense comics from the 60s, where he does actually kind of encounter Hitler. But yeah, I really dig the Joe Simon, Jack Kirby era. I especially dig kind of Joe Simon's kind of like gruesome vibes here. I don't gel as well with the art, and the art takes a massive nosedive whenever Jack Kirby leaves. Jack Kirby and I think Joe Simon as well both had to leave the character because they actually ended up fighting in World War II after America got involved. And it got taken over by like a couple artists who just were not as good. That is rough to get through. But yeah, that's kind of all I have to talk about. Next time we'll talk about the Return of the Red Skull again. We'll talk about actually no, we'll talk about the Fang. We'll talk more about Red Skull. Some of these other villains from the 1940s, and there's just not a whole lot of substance in 1940s Cap or 1940s comics in general. And as it goes on, the art gets progressively worse and worse until it does eventually get canceled in the mid-1940s, shortly after World War II ends. And Captain America remained dormant for about a decade after that. Got brought back very briefly by a couple writers, and John Romita Sr. actually for the Comic Crusher era, but that only lasted like 3 issues, and then he went dormant again. And then finally in the 60s, he would get a full-on reboot, revamp with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And he's been a consistent staple in the Marvel pantheon ever since. And we will talk about all that and possibly more next time on the Chronicles of Captain America. Thank you for watching.